Hi, this is Jorge Economics, and in this video, we're going to take a look at the second largest scam ever pulled on the human race. And that scam is the fiat currency scam. So, what is fiat currency? Well, fiat currency is essentially currency backed by nothing. So, if it wasn't used to transact, it would have no value. Think of the Australian dollar, the US dollar. Real money is something like a gold standard, where it's backed by something real, an asset or commodity that has value outside of its transaction. So, for example, if you compare the Australian dollar to, let's say, a Jorge dollar that's backed by gold, if all of a sudden both mediums of exchange were no longer used to transact, the gold-backed currency would start value because it's gold. You can redeem it for gold. So, the reason it's a scam is because it allows the banking class to steal wealth from the citizens. So how do they steal from the citizens? So essentially, the bankers can now create loans out of thin air. So in a honest system, the bank, if someone comes to the bank and says, I want to borrow $100,000, the bank finds a depositor who's deposited $100,000, who's paying them, let's say, 2%, takes that $100,000 deposit, gives it to the borrower, and charges 3%. So the bank makes 1% profit. That's the spread. It makes a 1% profit. But when there's currency backed by nothing, the bank has a second option. Just create the loan out of thin air. Instead of taking $100,000 and charging the 3% and making 1%, why not just create the loan out of thin air, make the full 3% on the loan? The bank would be making significantly more profits. So that's what they're doing. If you look at a graph, any graph of the banking class relative to the rest of the economy, it's like this. They have so much wealth, so much money in the banking industry. How? What services is so valuable from the bank that warrants them to have this much profit? Nothing. It's not because they're making that value. It's not because they're creating that wealth. It's because they're stealing it. They're creating loans out of thin air. And what happens when they do that is when they create a loan out of thin air, they are increasing the supply of the currency, the Australian dollar. What gives that newly created money or that newly created currency value is the existing currency, right? So every Australian citizen holding Australian dollars, they lose value when the bank creates loans out of thin air, because the bank is increasing the supply of the currency, which takes value away from the existing currency. So these banks, these private Australian banks that are creating loans out of thin air, are essentially stealing wealth, stealing purchasing power from any citizen holding Australian dollars. Now, what's the byproduct of this? Firstly, banks become over-leveraged. Banks are very exposed to their debts. They're very over-leveraged because they're lending out this much, but they've only got this much in their reserves. It's because they're just creating the loans out of thin air. They're not actually taking deposits and lending them out as borrowing. They're just creating the loans out of thin air. So banks become over-leveraged. They become very exposed. They're in a lot of risk. The second byproduct is banks make unfathomably more profits, because instead of making the spread, so the difference between what you pay the deposit and what you charge the borrower, the bank just makes what they charge the borrower. There's no spread. They just make the full amount of interest on the loans that they created out of thin air. So the bank makes significantly more profits. The third byproduct is the most sinister, which is inflation, right? Because when these banks create loans out of thin air, it's increasing the supply of our currency. It's creating inflation. And inflation is a tax. It's a tax on the people and on future generations. So the three byproducts of this scam, of this fiat currency scam, this banking scam, we'll call it, because it's for the bankers, it's enforced by the bankers, it's a banking scam, is one, banks make super amount of profits. So much profits. They pay millions and millions of dollars. Super profits. Second is that the banks become overexposed and over-leveraged. It would only take a small percentage of depositors to take their money out and the bank would be broke because the bank has this much deposits but has lent out this many loans because they're creating the loans out of thin air. So the banks are in a very risky situation. They don't have to worry about that though, because the government provides them all the liquidity they need. The government works for the bankers, but we'll talk about how the government protects this scam in another video. And the third byproduct is inflation. The banks, by creating these loans out of thin air, are inflating the supply of Australian dollars. So anyone who is holding Australian dollars is losing value because these banks are increasing the supply of the currency, which means everyone holding the currency is losing value. Remember, wealth is like energy. It can't be destroyed. It can only be transferred. So when we say there's inflation, where's that wealth going? We're saying, oh, you're losing 2%. You're losing 2% of your wealth to inflation. Well, where's that 2% going? It can't just be disappearing into heaven, into thin air. It's going to the bankers. They are the ones taking that money. Now, we're told it's 2%. It's really about 10 to 15%. I'll make a video about the inflation propaganda in the future. Either way, the point is, when we lose our wealth to inflation, the banks are the ones taking that wealth. They're stealing that wealth because they're the ones that are increasing the supply of the currency. They're the ones inflating the currency. So in summary, the scam, the fiat currency scam, the banking scam, is bankers get to create loans out of thin air. And thus they make exponentially more profits. The byproduct of the scam is that the bankers are stealing from the citizens because the bankers inflate the currency supply. They create more currency by creating Australian dollar loans. So they're increasing the supply of Australian dollars, which means everyone holding Australian dollars, all the citizens holding Australian dollars, are losing. Their wealth is being stolen from them by this inflation from the banks. So the scam, the reason it's a scam is because the bankers are stealing purchasing power, are stealing wealth from the citizens by creating loans out of thin air, which inflates the currency supply, which means everyone holding the currency now has less wealth because the currency is worth less because there's more of it.